A hurricane blasts its way towards the Mississippi coast.
It's a storm I don't think the people were prepared for.
Trapping many in its fury.
You felt like the wind was being sucked out of you.
As winds reached 200 miles per hour, it became a night of sheer terror for some and heroic rescues for others.
We were finding people on telephone poles. We were finding people in trees. So we knew it was getting bad.
Those that lived through that night have never forgotten the wrath of Hurricane Camille. On August 16, 1969, the National Hurricane Center ordered a storm tracker plane from Ramey Air Force Base in Puerto Rico to get a closer look at a hurricane named Camille. It had just blasted its way across western Cuba and had been downgraded to a tropical storm. But there was some concern that the warm waters of the Gulf would refuel it again, bringing it back to hurricane status. Lee Snyder was on board the storm tracker plane in the eye of Camille. As he relayed the information back to the Hurricane Center, he was one of the first to realize the true magnitude of the storm.
We have graphs that have little ink pens to give you ordinates, and they're skipping all over the place. They were anticipating about a 12-foot tidal surge. They had to rework it all, major evacuation now versus, well, maybe we can handle 12 feet to a certain distance. That report was a difference between the evacuation we had planned or 10,000 tombstones.
The National Guard in Biloxi, Mississippi was activated. They were told to be prepared to help evacuate the area in the event the storm worsened. Captain Glenn Ryan was in charge of one of the units.
About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we got word that the storm had turned more to the north. And so we started then preparing for it. We felt like we might get a hit.
The tiny Mississippi town of Pass Christian appeared to be in the direct path of the hurricane. It averaged only 20 feet above sea level. Merv Jones, the manager of the Richelieu Apartments, was already working with another resident to storm-proof the building.
Storm's coming, Ben. Want some help?
Merv knew the storm could be fierce, but assured both Ben Duckworth and Steve Anker it had survived Hurricane Betsy 3 years earlier. He said their apartment building was designated as a civil defense shelter, so it was safe enough if they wanted to stay.
There was never any strong suggestion that we leave. I know the news was that the highways were pretty crowded. Again, we didn't know where the storm was going at that time.
Across town, high school principal George Watson received a call from the Civil Defense requesting that he come to the Pass Christian High School and prepare to receive evacuees. The building was about 15 feet above sea level. They thought the large structure could weather the coming onslaught.
And when all of these people were there, I knew that they were going to depend upon my decision-making for their lives. And I felt that it was a lot of responsibility.
In nearby Gulfport, Abby Fisher could make few decisions for herself as she lay in the Longview nursing home. Abby suffered from polio and was required to be in an iron lung 24 hours a day in order to breathe. It was powered by electricity, and although the lung had a battery backup, Abby was concerned about the possibility of a power failure. National Guard units were directed to various locations around the Gulf, 29 of them with Larks, amphibious vehicles that could drive on land and propel themselves through water. Captain Ryan and Sergeant Dildy were sent to patrol the streets of Pass Christian. Specialist 4th Class Henry Lee Tort's unit was sent to evacuate people near the shore. By early evening, Duckworth and Anchor had decided to stay and ride out the storm. They were approached by an elderly couple who also lived in the building.
They had asked, you know, Ben, if you and your friends are going to stay, would you watch after me and my wife? She had broken her hip, and she was in a wheelchair. And so that was the first really decision point for me to stay.
The small group would take shelter in an unoccupied third-floor apartment. Mr. Matthews made everybody some food to keep up their energy. Merv Jones helped make sure everyone was comfortable and prepared for the worst. By 7, the front of the storm hit the coast. High winds and a torrential downpour began pummeling the seaboard with a vengeance. Hurricane Camille was now a Category 5 hurricane, the deadliest imaginable. Channel markers that were usually standing 8 to 10 feet above the water horizon now were nearly underwater. Water from the Gulf was starting to pour over the seawalls and flood low-lying areas. Captain Glenn Ryan's unit was monitoring the water's advance near a bridge.
As the winds got stronger, the waves got higher, and the water was pushed farther. It was almost like a wall, you know, just lifting up as that water was rolling in, like a tidal wave.
In a matter of minutes, water had completely covered the first floor of the Richelieu apartments. The men now realized they were trapped by the floodwaters. As the storm worsened, people who hadn't evacuated earlier now began to fear the storm and seek shelter. At Howard Memorial Hospital in Biloxi, Dr. Jerry Atkins was in charge of the ER.
I got a call from the chief of staff of the hospital. He said, "You're the only single and youngest member to the staff," so I wasn't married at the time, and he said, "I think you're the logical one to come to the hospital." We didn't have emergency room physicians, and so he said, "I think you ought to come and stay in the hospital tonight in case we have some injuries or that sort of stuff."
By 8:30 in the evening, winds had reached gusts of 100 miles per hour. Principal Watson received a call that concerned him.
I was told that the gymnasium at my school, where I was principal, had just blown down, and that maybe I should consider taking a good look at where we were, because they felt that it blew down because of the fact that there were no structures to hold it together.
he decided to check out the cafeteria. But the winds were very strong between the buildings. Getting to the cafeteria would be dangerous. He needed to come up with another plan. Back at the Richelieu Apartments, low barometric pressure caused a pressure variance between the outside and the inside of the building. The noises it created sounded like the building was breathing. The residents thought if they opened some windows, it might actually relieve the pressure.
The wind was really getting noisy. The rain was getting very noisy. We were all beginning to get a little uneasy about that time, but we were still trying to bolster the courage of everybody in the group.
Then at 9:30, the lights went out. As the sounds of the storm raged outside, the power failed in the Longview nursing home. Abby Fisher's iron lungs stopped working. For a few moments, Abby had trouble breathing until the battery backup kicked in. A nurse came over and told her not to worry because the battery was fully charged.
I went back to the gymnasium and I looked up at the wall and I noticed a crack in the south wall of the gymnasium. And almost simultaneously, a gust of wind blew the windows out of the north end of the gymnasium. There were high windows up near the top. And this glass blew all over the gymnasium floor.
Watson knew they now had to get out of the gymnasium. He made a decision. They would try to get to the school's main building.
I said, I think I would feel most secure if we were in another building.
He told them they should grab each other's wrists and walk through the storm together. Watson was concerned that they not lose anyone.
They fall, drag them, but don't turn them loose. And I said, because the wind is blowing fairly heavy, and there's going to be debris blowing around. And if something hits you, just don't turn it loose to grab it. Just keep on going.
One couple did not want to go into the storm. They would take their chances in the gymnasium. Watson tried to convince them that it wasn't safe to remain. More windows could be blown out. But they insisted they would stay put. The group fought their way through the fierce winds. The wind and rain was even stronger than Watson's earlier foray. But with the evacuees following his lead, he felt he no longer had a choice about turning back. Watson began leading over 250 people linked together in a human chain. The winds of Hurricane Camille were now howling at over 150 miles per hour, and there was no let-up in sight. It was an August Sunday, when Camille, a Category 5 hurricane, slammed into the Gulf Coast. In Pass Christian, Mississippi, Principal George Watson and several hundred evacuees had taken shelter in a high school gymnasium. But it had proven not to be a safe haven. He made the risky decision to move the entire party to the main building. They were relieved to be inside, yet concerned about the security of their new sanctuary. Principal Watson tried to allay their fears.
I told them to get in the halls and to find a spot in the halls, because this is where we would stay until the storm blew over. And I said, there's nothing to fear, because we're going to ride this thing out.
The National Guard were out in the streets, trying to rescue people who had refused to evacuate and were now in great danger. Specialist 4th Class Henry Letort's unit had received calls of people stranded on the rooftops.
We put our searchlights on, and as we got down there, we could see the water was up to the roofs of some houses, and people were standing on the roofs of the houses, calling for us to come over there. We were finding people on telephone poles. We were finding people in trees. Just anything they could cling to.
A small group of residents of the Richelieu apartments had banded together and waited out the storm in a 3rd-floor apartment. Ben Duckworth could sense there was real fear in the room.
I know that there were several prayers that were offered about our safety that night. I think Mr. and Ms. Matthews' presence with her in the wheelchair was a sobering influence on all of us.
Windows were now breaking on the 3rd floor. The building was simply not designed to withstand hurricane-force winds of this magnitude. The eye of the storm would make land just west of Pass Christian. Since the most intense winds occurred just east of the eye, the town was about to be hit with the strongest winds yet. The storm was now raging at over 200 miles per hour and cutting a devastating path in its wake. Earlier in the day, the Hurricane Center had sent up a storm tracker plane. They were flying around the eye of the storm.
This can't be right.
Lee Snyder was relaying back last-minute data about the storm's intensity.
You're picking your way around the thunderstorms and getting your data together. The only time you start to brace for any type of something your aircraft's going to go through that might be difficult is the penetration of the eye itself, because there's a lot of activity there.
At Howard Memorial Hospital, the basement began to flood. This caused the backup generators to fail, leaving the hospital without electricity. It also forced people who were taking refuge in the basement to move to higher ground.
We all got concerned. The windows in the hospital were all rattling pretty loudly, and the water was coming in through every window and under every door. But I think there was some real concern that if this thing gets much worse, we may all be in for a rough time. The children, the younger people, had blankets and pillows and on the floor asleep. The older people were very, very quiet, nervous, not asking for anything, listening to the radio. I think there was a great deal of concern.
At the Pass Christian Gymnasium, a couple who had not moved with the other evacuees tried to remain calm. Then suddenly, the entire roof blew away. They were now fully exposed to the storm's fury. Lucky to have survived the destruction, they fled the building and made their way to join the other evacuees. George Watson continued to watch and wait in the hallway.
We were inside of the school building, and all of a sudden we heard a knock at the door. And I opened the door and they came in. And you could see on their faces that they had a problem. And what happened? And they said, the gym blew down.
At the Longview nursing home, polio victim Abby Fisher lay in an iron lung, now operating on reserve battery power.
Is everything okay?
The battery had drained much quicker than anyone had realized. It was almost half empty. Bob Graham, the nursing home director, needed to find another way to power the machine, and quickly. The winds continued to blast the Richelieu apartment building. There was nothing between this structure and the ocean itself. Ben Duckworth thought they should check how high the water had risen around the building.
I shined the flashlight down the stairwell and I saw a reflection back. The water was literally about a foot below the third floor slab. It wasn't a tidal wave, it was a steady surge that the water generally throughout that whole area had risen 28 feet.
Even though they knew the floodwater had risen quickly, they told the Matthews not to worry. They were high enough up to avoid a possible storm surge. It was 11 p.m., and the eye of the storm was scheduled to move through Pass Christian in the next half an hour. Little did they know that the storm was creating a wall of water that was almost 30 feet high and rising fast. Hurricane Camille had been raging across the Gulf for the better part of a day and night. The monstrous storm system was sustaining 190-mile-per-hour winds. The tiny Gulf town of Pass Christian was completely flooded. 5 residents at the Richelieu apartment building were holding up in a third-floor apartment. By 11 p.m., water had risen to within a foot of the third floor. What they didn't realize was the worst part of the storm was yet to come. A hurricane creates a phenomenon known as a storm surge. The force of the wind swirling around the storm pushes water ahead of the massive system. Given the intensity of Camille, the storm surge was now projected to be between 20 and 30 feet high. Lee Snyder had been tracking Camille since the storm had crashed through Cuba.
It's a storm I don't think the people were prepared for. You know really how 24 feet from the ground up, how high that is? And then think of it as water coming at you.
Help!
On the ground, the National Guard continued to rescue people trapped by the rising water.
Over here. Okay, we got get two on the side. Give me the rope.
A lot of evacuees grabbed their most valuable possessions, like family photos and jewelry. Surprisingly, some people even took tax records. Glenn Ryan's unit was heading back to the shelter at City Hall when his Lark suddenly lost power and began to drift in the tide. Ryan asked Sergeant Dildy to check out the propeller. Without hesitation, Dildy dove into the water. a few moments he resurfaced and told Ryan the propeller shaft had sheared off. The rescue team and their passengers were now in dire need of help. At the Pass Christian High School, water had begun to pour into the hallway of the building where George Watson and the other evacuees had most recently taken shelter. This was their second refuge, and now Watson knew he had to move the group again. He decided they should go to the auditorium. Once in the theater, Watson realized he could take advantage of the sloped floor. If any water did come in, it would run to the low point right before the stage. He told people to remain at the back of the auditorium at the top of the sloped floor.
The families were in their little groups, and you could see them in huddles, and the mothers were holding the children close, and I guess they were almost afraid to say anything, but no, there was no hysteria in their eyes or in their demeanor.
At the Longview nursing home, the backup battery of Abby Fisher's iron lung was almost empty.
Everything's fine.
Without the lung to breathe for her, Abby would die.
I'll have to go check on a few things.
Bob Graham, the nursing home director, told her not to
Don't
panic.
worry about a thing. I'll be right back. Got it all figured
He
out.
had an idea. Graham knew that Abby's iron lung was powered by a 12-volt battery. The only other 12-volt batteries at the nursing home were in the cars parked outside. He would take the batteries from the cars and try to connect them to the ventilator. At Howard Memorial Hospital, an employee complained to Dr. Adkins that she was having abdominal pain. She explained that she had tried to ignore it all day, but it just kept getting worse. After an examination, Dr. Adkins diagnosed her condition as acute appendicitis.
Even though we didn't have electricity, we didn't have lights, I felt it was necessary to go ahead and do an appendectomy on her.
Without lights or monitoring equipment, this routine surgery was now quite risky. Even though Dr. Adkins had performed a similar operation in the Navy, he was concerned.
I got nervous because I wanted to wait until things were back to normal, but I really had a gut feeling that this lady, if I wait till tomorrow, she's going to perforate. We had to use the largest flashlights we could get our hands on. Nurses and other personnel had to stand around to try to shine the flashlights in the right place. Dr. Waddell was able to do a good spinal, then he put on gloves and health retractors, and the operation went pretty good. Got the appendix out before it ruptured and drained her. After we got out of surgery, you'd hear this tremendous loud roaring type noise, and you hear a lot of popping and crackling, and you knew it was trees and limbs breaking and that sort of stuff. Then it would quieten down for a few minutes. So it's my belief that those were tornadoes inside the hurricane that we were hearing, and it occurred to me for the very first time that we could die right here.
The Lark was useless without the ability to steer and was drifting on the dangerously flooded street. Then Captain Ryan noticed a pipe emerging from the water. He knew he had to try to tie up the Lark for everyone's safety. Even though the pipe was less than 30 feet away, the wind and the strong current were thwarting his efforts to reach it. his men in the Lark decided to pull him back in. Sergeant Dildy had been looking around for another way to anchor the Lark. Then they got a lucky break. The Lark had drifted fairly close to a telephone pole emerging from the water. Dildy quickly grabbed the rope and dove in. When he reached the pole, he tied off the Lark. Now he had to fight his way through the current to get back. Once Dildy was on board, one of the men alerted Ryan that a woman they rescued was showing signs of a heart problem. Ryan moved to her side. She was conscious, but Ryan knew she needed to get medical attention as soon as possible. Ryan had no sooner attended to the woman when Dildy said one of the guards was out cold. Ryan went over to him. He looked dead. Ryan attempted to hear his breath and heartbeat above the howl of the wind.
I raised his head up and I kind of popped him in the chest. Not too hard, but I popped him right over the heart. And when I did, he reared up like a bear. So when he breathed, you know, when he grunted like that, then I knew he was alive.
Ryan immediately radioed their situation and put out the word that they needed help. The nearest Lark was commanded by Henry Leetord. Leetord told Ryan his unit would come get them, but Ryan was afraid it was just too dangerous.
And I said, Henry, stay where you are. Let's wait until this thing subsides a little bit. He said, I'm coming to get you, Cap.
At the Richelieu Apartments, the residents who stayed behind tried their best to remain calm, but their nerves were shot. Ben Duckworth tried to reassure the group the eye of the storm was supposed to pass by 11:30. If they and the building could last until then, they would be fine. No sooner had he said these words when they all felt something ominous.
An imperceptible shudder went through the building, and you could feel it, and we all exchanged glances. And then it was almost like everything exploded.
The 30-foot storm surge had hit the building with a vengeance, and water was now pouring in from the ceiling. Duckworth and Anchor knew they had to get everyone out of the apartment before the building collapsed. The only way out was through the roof. As Duckworth pulled himself up through the hole, a nail ripped a gash in his leg, but he kept on going. Below, Anchor grabbed Mrs. Matthews and pushed her toward the ceiling. Then he followed. Mr. Matthews could not muster the strength to get out and collapsed on the floor. Anchor realized he could not go back down and help. There was now nothing between the Richelieu apartment residents on the roof and the devastating power of the storm. Against the full force of the hurricane, they desperately tried to hold on to the roof as it floated away. Hurricane Camille was tearing apart the Mississippi coast. A storm surge of over 30 feet had washed ashore and destroyed the 3-story Richelieu apartment building in Pass Christian. 4 residents had managed to make it up through a hole in the roof and now tried to hold on as the wind and waves continued to assault them. But within minutes, the roof was underwater, and the storm surge washed them all into the churning sea. Ben Duckworth struggled to keep afloat. He could not see the others. Frantic, he looked for something to hold on to. He saw a tree branch floating by and grabbed it. Yet even with the buoyancy of the branch, he was pulled under the waves. Fighting for every breath, he held on as tight as he could. He had no idea how long he could survive like this. Hurricane Camille was forcing everyone in her wake to find a way to survive. At the Longview nursing home, Bob Graham had retrieved some car batteries and was trying to hook one up to power Abby Fisher's iron lung. As their disabled amphibious vehicle bobbed in the surf, National Guard Captain Ryan and Sergeant Dilby tried to care for 2 sick passengers. One was a person they had rescued. The other was a sergeant in their unit. Without any type of medical equipment, the best they could do was try and keep them warm and dry. But their efforts were futile. Ryan had called for assistance, and another Lark was on the way. In the Pass Christian High School auditorium, George Watson and a group of evacuees thought they were safe from Camille's fury. Then they saw water coming in under the doorway.
Bring me some blankets! Hurry up!
They quickly grabbed blankets and tried to seal off the door.
I asked some of the men to stand at the doors and brace themselves. Let me know if you needed anybody else, but just stand there and make certain that the doors don't blow open.
Yet the blankets were no match for the fury outside. The horizontal rain, the flooding, and the hurricane-force winds pushed the rising water in through every crack. The auditorium was quickly beginning to flood. The only thing they could do was retreat to the highest part of the sloped floor.
The walls on the south side of the building, of the auditorium, was pulsating. As I would lean against the wall, I would say that it was moving in and out. That was my gravest concern during the midst of the storm. If that wall had given away, all of us would have drowned like rats.
Henry Lee Tort's unit finally found Captain Ryan's amphibious vehicle. The first thing they had to do was tie the 2 vehicles together to facilitate transporting everyone off the Lark. They took the 2 sick people off first. Then the others followed, and they took off towards the hospital. With no time to spare, Bob Graham at the Longview Nursing Home was able to connect one of the car batteries to Abby Fisher's iron lung.
Here it comes. Right now.
He had no idea how long it would last, but at least there were more, and he had a temporary solution to keep her alive. Ben Duckworth had managed to stay above water for 10 minutes by holding on to a tree branch. But the battering waves were too much and finally swept away his lifeline. Just when he thought he couldn't keep going, he hit an oak tree that was still rooted in the ground. He grabbed the trunk and, using every bit of strength he had left, pulled himself up as high as he could out of the water. The howling winds and the surging waters continued to pummel him. The winds were so strong, he found that he couldn't catch his breath. The only way he could get oxygen was to bury his face in the crevices on the trunk itself.
I thank God that it was an oak tree because they have rivulets in the bark, and I was able to push my nose up against the bark of the tree in order to breathe. I know the few times I took my head away from that tree limb, you felt like the wind was being sucked out of you.
There was no sign or sound of the others from his building. They too were on their own in this hellish nightmare. How long Ben Duckworth could hold on to the tree would be the deciding factor as to whether he would outlive the wrath of Camille. The entire coastal town of Pass Christian, Mississippi, was virtually underwater. Along the Gulf Coast, 131 people were reported dead as a result of Hurricane Camille's fury. Ben Duckworth had survived his apartment building's collapse and now clung desperately to an oak tree. At the Pass Christian High School, George Watson and the evacuees in his charge watched helplessly as water flooded their shelter. His wife kept a vigil at the window.
We could see the water rising, and we could see exactly where it was when she shined the light. And I told my wife, just keep watching that, and if it gets above the windowsill, let me know.
National Guardsman Henry Lee Torch Lark eventually made its way to Howard Memorial Hospital. Two of his passengers, one a guardsman and the other a rescue victim, appeared to be suffering from some sort of heart ailment and were immediately taken care of. Many of the people Dr. Adkins attended to that night complained of chest pains. He diagnosed that the great majority of them were suffering stress symptoms brought on by being in the storm. The patients from the Lark were okay, but were admitted to the hospital for further observation. Ben Duckworth hadn't quit either. By dawn, he was alive and watching the water under him begin to recede. He had held on to the trunk of the oak tree for 4 desperate hours. Then he heard a most reassuring sound. Someone was calling up to him from under the tree.
Are you okay? I'll get you down there. What's your name? Ben. Ben, take your time. Watch my left leg. Okay. Come
And the wind had died down considerably from the height when I first got in the tree. And until the gentleman was standing below the tree where I was and saying, we found one, did I really realize that it was real.
The men took Duckworth to the local high school, the closest place for medical treatment. At Howard Memorial Hospital, a decision was made to move everyone outside.
When it started getting a little light, we moved everything out into the parking lot. The OR tables and the examination tables and all the suturing equipment. I saw true character, and I saw a lot of good-hearted people that wanted to help one another.
Hurricane Camille left the tiny town of Pass Christian looking like a war zone.
At daybreak, we opened the doors, took the quilts away, opened the doors, and went outside, and then when we looked outside, it looked like a bomb had hit. And you knew then that everything had blown away.
Throughout the night, 8 car batteries had provided power to Abby Fisher's iron lung. Finally, a generator was obtained to provide electricity to the nursing home. Ben Duckworth needed hospitalization, but was found to be in relatively good health. He was told that Steve Anker had survived, but Merv Jones and Mr. and Mrs. Matthews hadn't. 23 others who lived at the Richelieu apartment building had also died that night. The following day, an Air Force plane flew over Pass Christian. Storm tracker Lee Snyder accompanied journalists viewing the damaged area.
And the destruction was just, it's like you could not comprehend what you were seeing, if that makes any sense. I mean, it was just, the devastation was just overwhelming.
Hurricane Camille claimed 131 lives along the coast. The storm proceeded up to Virginia, where flash floods and landslides killed another 113. She officially died out 7 days after first crossing Cuba. In Pass Christian, 50 people died. But because of critical decisions made by ordinary citizens and trained professionals, hundreds of people who did not evacuate survived the storm's wrath. National Guard units were credited with rescuing over 300 people. President Nixon visited the devastated areas. The federal government came in with relief. The destruction would be equivalent to over $6 billion today, making it the third most powerful hurricane to hit the United States.